Hello and welcome to the second video in a series of backup videos as I'm calling for ASPB1105 in 2020. We're now going to talk about the Arctic and geopolitics and in terms of international security for the Arctic. In the first video I mentioned that the Arctic Ocean is surrounded by countries. Now, what we're going to look at now is how these countries interact with each other and what security actually means for the people who live in the Arctic, which different types of security we can find in the Arctic, how international law can play a role in the Arctic. Security can have different meanings for different people in different contexts. It can, first of all, mean national security. Russia now announced a few days ago that in their upcoming chairmanship of the Arctic Council starting next year, they want to focus on national security, which is a novelty for the Arctic Council, something the Council hasn't done before, intentionally. The Arctic Council member states intentionally stayed away from that so far. National security, as defined by Durfee and Johnstone, is to quote, security of the territory of the state and the people within from external invasion or unwanted interference, end of quote. On this classical national security, we have different ways to ensure national security in the Arctic. We have actors which are acting on their own, like Russia. We have NATO playing an important role for a big part of the Arctic. And we have the two non-NATO but EU member states, Finland and Sweden, which closely cooperate with other countries. But there's also human security. Human security is then closely connected to human rights. It is the idea that you're secure in your everyday life. That's a broader approach to security. So not just this military approach, but also an approach that could involve, for example, the local police force. Human security means that also the state is obliged to provide a certain level of protection. For example, in situations like domestic violence, which unfortunately remains a major issue in a lot of places in the Arctic. Human security also means security protection against your own government if needed. Security is also not the same as safety. Also, in some languages, the same term is used for both. Safety basically means protection against risks, which are not necessarily human-made. The best example or best way to describe this, the best picture I can think of is, for safety you need a fire extinguisher. When we talk about security, we're talking about, let's say, a door lock. Societal security means that you have a society which aims at creating security for the individual. To quote Durfee and Johnstone again, societal security means that a community is free to create, express, change, or preserve customs considered central to their identities, end of quote. And that's something which is a major challenge across the Arctic in many places. Identity is often linked to culture, to your traditions, to the place where you live, to the connection to the land where you live, to your families, to what you do for a living, things like that. It's something that can change over time. It's nothing static. Just like a community's identity, just like your own, is not something that's created once and then set in stone forever. Societal security, therefore, requires freedom, but also a certain level of protection, a framework which allows us to express this freedom, to live this freedom. Other forms of security can be more specific, for example, food security. Even though the Arctic countries are relatively rich countries, food security is an issue, for example, in remote locations in Greenland. Negative impacts on the natural environment can directly negatively influence food security. These different types of security, and these are just a few examples, not an exhaustive list, they are connected to each other. They're interlinked, so to say. And they also influence each other. And they're connected to human rights. They're also connected to the issue of safety. The Arctic, in many ways, remains a part of the world which is hazardous. The specific risks, for example, to human health or to human safety, which are Arctic specific. You might have similar risks elsewhere, but they're rather pronounced in the Arctic. That's something you can see, for example, during the winter months when we have long periods of night or at least darkness. You can see it when it comes to things like road safety, traffic safety, and international law is also concerned with that from a regulatory perspective, with the aim of enhancing human safety. Disaster risk reduction law, for example, is a growing field of international law which is connected to other fields, for example, human rights or maritime safety law. One scenario that has long been troublesome for people in the Arctic concerned with safety issues is a scenario of what happens if there's a major cruise ship disaster in the Arctic. For now, cruise operations are of course put on hold due to the pandemic, but we have to assume that tourism will eventually resume and that this will become a challenge again in the future. Similar questions can be asked with regard to major disasters on land as well, of course. The first responders will often be locals. They might have some training or no training at all. Trained professionals in emergency situations are fairly rare. Keep in mind the long distances in the Arctic and the sparse population density. Cooperation in search and rescue operations, therefore, is crucial in the Arctic. This requires coordination, it requires infrastructure. If you look at places in the European high north, like Kautokeino, for example, you'll see that you're hundreds of kilometers away from the next hospital. This is a safety issue. It's also a human rights issue. Making sure that you have sufficient infrastructure in place to provide access to appropriate healthcare is a human rights question. It's therefore not surprising that search and rescue operations have been a concern for the countries of the European High North for a long time, and that SAR search and rescue is one of the issues that's covered by an international treaty which has been created under the auspices of the Arctic Council. Human security requires access to healthcare, including emergency healthcare. That also requires healthcare in your native language, including in the indigenous languages, which is a major challenge across the Arctic. In the Arctic, we also see a number of specific risks. For example, when it comes to the high suicide rate, when it comes to domestic violence. These are issues that have to be addressed as well. And states have an obligation to create infrastructure and maintain it, to make sure that they do all they can to reduce these risks, to provide as much protection as possible. This brings us to classical human rights law in terms of social rights, including the right to health and the corresponding obligation of the states to have a health infrastructure in place. Another form of security which is relevant in the Arctic is food security. food security requires you to have access to food, to healthy food. Especially in remote communities, this is often not the case. If you cannot engage in your traditional livelihoods, just hunting, for example, anymore, because of environmental pollution, then you become more and more dependent on imported foods. Keep in mind the long distances in the Arctic, and you will see that food prices will, of course, rise dramatically the more remote location is. That is for imported foods, for foods that have been transported over long distances. Often measures which have had a positive intention initially can have negative effects. We can see this, for example, with the construction of infrastructure in the Arctic, which can have negative impacts on traditional livelihoods like reindeer herding. Food insecurity can also be caused by regulations. For example, if you regulate hunting and fishing. In Finland, not long ago, had a case concerning the Deatnan River at the border of Finland and Norway, and the rights of indigenous people to fish in this river, which is in their home area. And of course, climate change can lead to food insecurity. Climate change has a direct impact on animals and plants in the Arctic. This impact can lead to a lack of access to healthy food. It can lead to reindeer, for example, not getting the nutrition they need. And in turn then, of course, disappearing as a food source for people. Security in the Arctic is often dependent on people being able to protect themselves. Asking for human security or emphasizing the need for human security does not only mean that the state is expected to do something. Rather, in particular in challenging situations such as the Arctic, the state is expected to, state has to empower people so that they can secure themselves, be this through their work, through traditional livelihoods, or whatever is appropriate in a given situation. Food security, therefore, depends on issues such as good governance, respect for human rights, respect for the rule of law, legal certainty, things like that. National security, on the other hand, is often seen in terms of a top-down relationship. It's often seen more in military terms. Right now, there's not really a realistic threat of an armed conflict starting in the Arctic, with the exception of a tiny island between Greenland and Canada, Hans Island or Tutupaluk. There are no territorial disputes between states in the Arctic. What is certainly possible is the same scenario we saw during the Cold War, that a conflict starting elsewhere might have spillover effects for the Arctic, might lead to conflict in the Arctic. Overall, there is a sense of cooperation also within the Arctic, which often transcends the political differences. But keep in mind that decisions are often made far from the Arctic, so that a good spirit of cooperation on the local level in a border area might quickly become useless if political decisions are made far from the Arctic with negative effects for the Arctic. Of course, different Arctic states have very different attitudes towards their own armed forces, different understandings of the role armed forces should play, especially in the Arctic. And it cannot be excluded that outside actors will in the future be more assertive in the Arctic, trying to push through their own interests. However, at this time, it seems unlikely that there's going to be a military conflict originating in the Arctic anytime soon. Keep in mind that national security is only one aspect of security. Other aspects include food security, the economy, of course, the environment, human health, but also political, personal, and community security. So we don't just have one definition of security, but rather we try to understand it here, or to look at it here from a holistic perspective, including personal security. Especially domestic violence is a major challenge, a major problem in many Arctic communities, even though it's one that's often not talked about. When we look at the situation in different places, such as, for example, Greenland or northern Finland or northern Russia, for the discussion, of course, we've chosen Greenland as an example, but we can have the same discussion about different places across the Arctic. How these international legal obligations that states have entered into. For example, in the Istanbul Convention, Council of Europe Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence. How these legal obligations actually translated into the practical reality on the ground. Is this just paper that has been signed by politicians, or is this something that makes a tangible difference in local communities? The European Court of Human Rights, for example, has recognized, and likewise it has been recognized under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, that states have a positive duty to take active measures against domestic violence. So there's a human rights obligation already existing here. And yet this remains a serious problem. Here, governance might reach its limits, at least in the form that happens right now. Because the laws already exist on paper, yet the problem continues to persist. This is one of the things that suggest we could discuss as to how far can law actually function, what can be the limits of law, and what could be the missing component here. For example, law enforcement, awareness, things like that. One of the aspects of security in the Arctic is also economic security. The Arctic is rich and poor at the same time. It's rich in material wealth, but people living in the Arctic often might see themselves as being disconnected from these riches, from the wealth. The benefits of what's taken out of the Arctic, the revenue which is generated in the Arctic, be that from the extractive industries or from tourism, a lot of that does not stay in the Arctic. So there's a real risk right now that the Arctic is just seen as a resource, as a place from which to take something, out of which to take something, without necessarily leaving a profit within the Arctic. In many parts of the Arctic, subsistence economy continues to play an important role. Fishing, hunting, reindeer herding. This is just one aspect of economic life in the Arctic, of course. Also among the indigenous peoples, a lot of indigenous people, of course, have what one could consider from an urban perspective more regular, non-traditional jobs. But of course, there's also a significant transfer economy, a significant public sector, especially in places like Greenland. Here we have to see how much are non-traditional forms of livelihood actually sustainable. How much does it make sense in the long term for an economy to be based on, let's say, mining, if you have long-term negative impacts on forms of livelihood which have worked for a long time, like reindeer herding, for example. At the same time, we have to look at climate change. Are these traditional forms of income, of livelihood, still possible in the future? Or is climate change making them impossible altogether? For example, if you think of salmon fishing, the rising temperatures already have an effect on the salmon as well. Water pollution has probably an inverse effect. So things are influenced very directly by the two driving factors, climate change and globalization. These are not just abstract issues here, but they have a real impact also on food security for the people who live in the Arctic. In the Arctic, we have a relatively large primary sector in hunting, fishing, reindeer herding, but also taking other natural resources like mining, through mining, for example. The service sector, which is often linked to transfer economy, meaning funding from outside the region, but a very limited what's called a secondary sector in the production of goods. Of course, we have some paper mills and so on in the Arctic, and other forms of production. But in relative terms, if you compare it to forestry, mining, and so on, fishing, forms of taking natural resources, the production of goods is relatively limited. One positive development, or at least at first sight positive development, recently is the IT industry in the widest sense of the term. For example, a lot of northern communities now are home to data centers. Because of climate change, a lot of companies are looking at places which are still have a relatively cold climate, and data centers are now being created in especially Sweden and Finland. But of course, these data centers need a lot of energy. So this energy has to come from somewhere. If this is, for example, hydropower, this can have an effect on local rivers. So this is not an easy fix. Yeah. So always keep in mind that all of this has additional consequences. A key problem that we have in the Arctic is that our economy is decoupled, meaning that a lot of what we produce is not actually used in the Arctic. Think of extracted minerals, for example, oil, gas, wood from forestry, and so on. Yet at the same time, a lot of the products we need in the Arctic, they're not made in the Arctic. They're not made locally or regionally. So we also have to import a lot of goods. This makes communities more dependent because we are no longer capable of providing completely for ourselves. Arctic communities are dependent on global markets. More so than in many other parts of the world. Of course, we all depend on globalization to some degree, but once your market, the market for you, the work you do, and minerals you extract, the oil, the gas, and so on, once the market is far away, you're completely dependent on others to actually buy what you have to sell. At the same time, you're dependent on others to get what you actually need. In remote places, for example, in parts of northern Greenland, places like Kirchner, that's something that's seen very clearly when you look at food prices here, for example. The benefits from economic activities in the Arctic often don't stay in the Arctic. Good example for that are cruise ships. Cruise ships in the Arctic often visit small Arctic locations. Passengers come out for the ship for a few hours, maybe take a few pictures, ideally buy a few souvenirs, consume, in a certain sense, even the local culture, which raises a whole number of other questions regarding cultural rights. So the amount of money spent there is relatively limited. A lot of these small communities, they end up with a lot of trash, for which they often don't have the capacity to take care of it properly. But the actual money that's spent to get the tourists there, that does not end in the local communities. So if you take a cruise ship, the passengers, of course, will sleep on board, they'll eat on board, and so on. All the time, the engines of the cruise ship are running because you need electricity for the ship, and so on. So you have actually more air pollution in these parts of the world, in these smaller communities. For very limited, a lot of downsides for very limited economic benefits, but often that is seen as already a great step forward in economic terms. Also, large distances result in high costs. Often we have limited flexibility. We don't necessarily have diverse economies in many places in the Arctic. If a municipality here in Northern Europe somewhere has both tourism and mining, that's already relatively diversified. Obviously, it's not diversified enough in order to compensate for shocks like, for example, the impact of the pandemic on tourism here. If you look at mining operations, you'll see that, of course, there's almost no flexibility. If you, let's say, mine for gold, your only product is gold. So it does not really matter how the market price for gold is, because that's the only thing you actually can produce. You cannot turn a gold mine into something else. And this limited flexibility leads to vulnerability, especially when we focus on the non-renewable resources like mining and oil. As I mentioned earlier, sustainable development remains a key challenge and a goal for the Arctic. On a positive note, we have a significant emphasis on renewable energy, hydropower especially. But of course, that too has a negative impact. Hydropower impacts life in the rivers. Wind energy can have a negative impact, for example, on the behavior of reindeer, and so on. What we do have in the Arctic, at least in the European high north, is a combination, however, of factors which allow the local communities to take action for themselves if the conditions are right. We have relatively high degree of political stability. We have relatively cheap renewable energy. We have also good internet connectivity. Data centers are one result of these factors. There are plans on the way to create a fiber optic cable, internet cable from Northern Europe through the entire Arctic Ocean to connect us better with Japan, which will give us also redundancy in internet connections. There's a great potential in the Arctic, especially in the rural Arctic. And the question now is, will this potential be realized in time? Or will we simply not have the people anymore to realize these possibilities? There are a number of different approaches on how to run an economy in the Arctic. The so-called North American model uses a high ratio of female to male inhabitants, we have a relatively low child mortality, high life expectancy, high levels of education, but also a high level of inequality. The Scandinavian model, on the other hand, has a better gender balance in paid employment. Average disposable income might be a bit lower, but also a high level of education, life expectancy, and low infant mortality. A higher rate of redistribution of funding, strong public services, and less inequality. The Russian economic model in the Arctic, on the other hand, is based on productivity. A high level of productivity due to the extractive industries, but this is not corresponding to the living standard of the people who live in the Russian Arctic. So we have a huge wealth gap, especially also between urban and rural residents, with bad results for the aforementioned cases like education, child mortality, and so on. We have inequality, a high level of inequality paired with a lack of social safety nets. And this results in a much higher level of leakage, meaning that the wealth which is being generated in the Russian Arctic doesn't stay in the Russian Arctic at all, or almost not at all. So these three models basically show that with different approaches here. The fourth model is Greenland, which is somewhere between the European and the American model. We have in Greenland, we see far more men than women in the population because of female emigration. There are significantly weaker health indicators than in Europe. The average disposable income, however, is even lower than in either Europe or North America, and a much higher rate of dependence. There's an informal subsistence economy, but the dependence rate is much higher. This is something that is not working that great at the moment. It remains to be seen how the situation in Greenland might change in the future. There's been a lot of debate about potential independence for Greenland, about the possibility that there might be more foreign direct investment from the US or China. But of course, with independence, Greenland would also lose a lot of the funding it gets now from Denmark. Given the developments of the last few years, it seems not unlikely that Greenland will become independent soon-ish, say within the next 10-15 years. And that would most likely move much closer to the North American economic model. But that remains to be seen, and at the end of the day, is a decision for the people in Greenland to make. What we often see in the Arctic is that there's not just a disconnect between producing and consuming, meaning we produce things we don't need and we consume things we don't have, but also the question, how far do different sectors support each other, complement each other? How important, economically speaking, are traditional forms of income? How important are, or how relevant, or dangerous are land use conflicts? Land use conflicts are a major problem, especially in places where we find indigenous communities, and which are seen as up for grabs, basically, by national governments. So that's something you'll see similarly, let's say in the Amazon forest and rainforest, or in the Arctic, where we have competing interests like mining versus indigenous traditional livelihoods. Indigenous communities have challenged resource extraction projects in different courts, different fora. Indigenous people from Sapmi have played an important role in this regard. There's been a series of cases at the Human Rights Committee, which deals with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, regarding conflicts between reindeer herding on one hand and extractive industries on the other hand. We find similar situations, for example, in Canada, where there's been conflict between mining and traditional livelihoods. But of course, mining also can generate jobs. Keep in mind that a lot of these places are not exactly blessed with a lot of work opportunities. So for a lot of communities, this might also be seen as an opportunity in economic terms, as a form of investment. There might also be secondary benefits like new roads, better healthcare services, better communication services. So it can be tempting for local communities to agree to mining projects from the perspective of improving their overall situation, also in terms of infrastructure. What's important is that these decisions should be made locally by the people who are actually affected by such activities. All too often, local and indigenous communities only have a limited say in these matters. Of course, the question then is, how much information are local communities actually given? Keep in mind that if the land is lost once, it cannot be restored easily, especially if it has been polluted from mining. Loss of land can mean loss of traditional forms of livelihood, a loss of culture, the region, and so on. But at the end of the day, this is up to the local communities, or at least it should be up to the local communities. Yet, not all states in the Arctic actually make this really possible. There are a number of interest groups involved in this. There might be corporations offering, basically making promises of material wealth, might be NGOs, which might have more of a focus on the environment than on the people who live there, and so on. What is important is that governance structures have to be in place which give indigenous peoples a say in these issues. Now, climate change is one of the key drivers here. It's not just globalization, but this is made possible or made faster by climate change. There's what's called the Arctic climate change paradox by Delphine Johnstone. Warmer temperatures in the Arctic make the Arctic more accessible, with the exception of places built on permafrost, which become even less accessible as the permafrost melts. But large parts of the Arctic become more accessible. There's less sea ice in the Arctic Ocean, there are warmer temperatures in the European high north, and so on. This increased accessibility makes it easier to exploit, for example, hydrocarbons, gas and oil. Burning gas and oil in turn increases climate change, increases the temperatures. Often the causes for climate change effects which we feel in the Arctic are often set outside the Arctic. So climate change is something that affects the Arctic, but only part of the cause is actually in the Arctic. Climate change makes land transport sometimes more difficult, especially when the permafrost melts. It changes the way animals behave. It changes the way the vegetation works. Fish stocks at sea move closer to the pole. There are new diseases, both for humans and animals. You might have heard of the anthrax outbreak in Russia some years ago. The Arctic is not disconnected from the rest of the world, far from it. The economies of the Arctic are connected to the global economy. But often Arctic communities don't have full control over their own economy. Goals are set in national capitals. Economic decisions are made by corporations which come from the outside. Often goals are set only with a view to short-term profits rather than long-term sustainable development. Often, Arctic communities don't have the chance to play an active role in shaping the governance of their home region. And when they do, they might not have the information which is necessary to actually make informed decisions. Things could be somewhat easier if there would be free and fair trade. But not even that is something that we have achieved in the Arctic so far. Free trade is an important aspect of a functioning global economy. Free and fair trade, to be precise. The Arctic does not have a singular free trade regime. We have the free trade region in North America, which has been changed, which has been renegotiated. We have the partial free trade agreement between the EU and Canada, which is only enforced in part, because it's a so-called mixed agreement and it's only enforced provisionally as far as the EU has the components. But on the other hand, we have EU sanctions against Russia. These affect especially the European High North, especially Finland, due to Russia's policy in the war in Ukraine. We have China coming in as a new actor with the Belt and Road Initiative, which has an Arctic component, an initiative which has been seen very critically, especially since the effect of ineptness have become more clear, for example, the case of Sri Lanka, and the effect Sri Lanka's participation had in this initiative, also national security there. What is needed for the Arctic in the long run is sustainable development, truly sustainable development, which also takes into account the human needs, the needs of the people who live in the Arctic. Sustainable development is also a human rights issue. It is not just a lofty goal or something only for economists. If you look at the sustainable development goals, you'll see the focus on quality education, for example, goal 4, or on good health and well-being, goal 3. These issues relate to human rights, which are already codified in international human rights treaties. Look, for example, at the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and you'll find the right to health in Article 12 and the right to education in Article 13. So here we have a clear link between sustainable development goals and social rights. The International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights is hardly a new instrument, rather it dates back to the 1960s. So this is not a new issue, but sustainable development is a new way to approach these human rights. On the other hand, is there also an argument to be made that there's a right, or should be a right, to development. Already in 1986, the UN General Assembly adopted the Declaration on the Right to Development. The General Assembly's declarations are not legally binding, unlike resolutions by the UN Security Council, but they have an important role to play in shaping the future of international law. Article 1, Paragraph 1 of the General Assembly Declaration on the Right to Development basically reads, a quote here, "The right to development is an inalienable human right, by virtue of which every human person and all peoples are entitled to participate in, contribute to, and enjoy economic, social, and cultural and political development, in which all human rights and fundamental freedoms can be fully realized." End of quote. The emphasis, not just on individuals, but on peoples, is not to international covenants, including the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which also include the right of people to self-determination, which is then also mentioned in Article 1, paragraph 2 of the same declaration. This means that peoples have the right to choose their own economic and political development. This also applies to the indigenous peoples of the Arctic, who have the right to make decisions with regard to their own development. The development is a human right, not a right in itself, but a pathway to the full realization of all human rights. Or not only a right, but it's not just an economic issue. Article 2 of the same Declaration of 1986 makes it clear that the individual, the human being, is at the core of all of this. And this is what international law should be about. At the end of the day, international law is about protecting communities and individuals. It serves to preserve peace among nations, which at the end of the day benefits all of us. Article 2, Article 2 itself is something I would like to read to you very briefly. Quote, "The human person is the central subject of development and should be the active participant and beneficiary of the right to development. All human beings have a responsibility for development, individually and collectively, taking into account the need for full respect for their human rights and fundamental freedoms, as well as their duties to the community, which alone can ensure the free and complete fulfillment of the human being. And they should therefore promote and protect an appropriate political, social, and economic order for development. States have the right and the duty to formulate appropriate national development policies that aim at the constant improvement of the well-being of the entire population and of all individuals on the basis of their active, free, and meaningful participation in development and in the fair distribution of the benefits resulting therefrom." End of quote. And that's what sustainable development is about, that we all get to have a stake in this. That there should be full respect for human rights, meaning that this is not development at all costs, not development that is bought for with human rights violations. Rather, that the human person is the subject. And subject is an important term for international lawyers. The humans are not just objects, but subjects. In international law, subjects are usually states, international organizations, and so on. Here we're talking about the subject of development. This is not something that is done to people, but something that people should participate in actively. We all have a stake in sustainable development. That means that there has to be an active participation of those affected. Economic development is not an end in itself. And the human right, for example, the human right to a healthy environment is something that has to be respected in this regard. International law recognizes the right to development, but with the human being at the center. Not economic development at all costs. Rather, connected to the self-determination of peoples, also with the ability of peoples to make their own decisions, to choose their own ways for development. One of the core aspects of sustainable development is respect for human rights, including access, for example, to education. Climate change and globalization are the two factors which today influence the Arctic more than anything else. These issues have a tremendous impact on the practical reality of life in the Arctic. Free and fair trade would be beneficial to Arctic communities, and fortunately in the last years the interests of indigenous communities have been taken into account more than before. Today a lot of trade agreements also include human rights norms, for example. In practice, however, this is not a story which is over. Rather, it's just beginning. It's continuing every day. And the full realization of human rights, be it the right to a healthy environment, the right to education, the right to food security, these rights have to be realized on the local level again and again every day. Often, this means not just the state refraining from violating human rights, but also this requires the state to do something active about this, to create institutions, to create participatory mechanisms, to make sure that the people in the Arctic are given a voice, that they are heard, that they play an active role in deciding the future of the Arctic. In the following video, we're going to look more closely at indigenous rights and international rights in the Arctic. And for now, thanks for your attention, and feel free to contact me should there be any questions.